Imagine living a life where your darkest secret follows you for 30 years until the day it finally catches up. What would you do if you were forced to face the consequences of a crime you thought you'd gotten away with? Stay tuned to watch as a man's past comes crashing down and his final reckoning begins. This is a story of guilt, lies, and the inescapable truth. The room was dim, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp outside. It cast long shadows on the cracked wallpaper. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was holding its breath. John stood still, staring at the photograph on the wall. It had been years since he'd seen it. He barely recognized the younger version of himself, grinning in the background. A cold sweat began to form on his neck. He turned away from the photo, eyes darting to the door. His hand trembled as he reached for the mug on the counter. The porcelain felt cool under his fingers, but his body was burning up. The creaking of the floorboards behind him sent a jolt through his spine. He wasn't alone. John spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just the empty chair by the window. He glanced at the clock on the wall, its ticking suddenly deafening in the silence. The second hand moved so slowly, too slowly. A knock at the door. John's blood ran cold. His mind raced, but his legs refused to move. The knock came again, louder this time. He hesitated, taking shallow breaths. It had been years. 30 years. The past was long buried, wasn't it? But something was pulling him back to it. Something he couldn't ignore. The knock came again, and this time, John knew it was no longer just a knock. It was a warning. He walked to the door, each step heavier than the last. His palms were clammy, his throat tight. He reached for the handle, but before he could turn it, a voice, low and almost mocking, came from behind him. "You thought you got away?" John's pulse raced. The voice was too familiar. He turned quickly, but there was no one. Just the empty room. He faced the door again. His hand was shaking as it gripped the handle. Slowly, he turned it. The door creaked open, revealing two men standing in the hallway. Their eyes were cold, their faces unreadable. One of them stepped forward, a badge gleaming in his hand. John's world tilted. His heart stopped. His breath caught. "I'm Detective Martin," the man said. "And this is Detective Ryan. We've come for you, Mr. Walker." John's body went numb. It hit him all at once. The past. The bodies. The lies. The weight of everything he had buried deep inside came crashing down. 30 years of freedom. 30 years of escape. And it was over. Just like that. The room felt smaller now. Suffocating. John's chest tightened with each breath. His mouth was dry. His mind was racing, but the words wouldn't come. Detective Martin stepped closer, his eyes never leaving John's. "You thought you were untouchable," he said, his voice a low growl. "You thought you'd gotten away with it." John took a step back, his back hitting the wall. The air in the room seemed to thicken, every second stretching longer than the last. His body felt heavy, like he was drowning in the weight of his own guilt. He couldn't speak. His throat had closed up. Detective Ryan's eyes scanned the room, pausing on the old photograph on the wall. His lips twisted into a slight smirk. "Funny," he said. "We've been looking for you for a long time. Thought we'd never find you. But here you are, right where we left you." John's mind flashed back to that night. The screams. The blood. The faces that had haunted his dreams for so many years. He had thought it was over. He had convinced himself that it was all behind him. But the truth always found its way to the surface, no matter how deep you buried it. And now it was here. He tried to find his voice. To explain. To deny. But the words stuck in his throat, lodged there like a choking stone. Detective Martin took another step forward. His eyes locked onto John's, filled with a chilling resolve. "You've been a ghost for 30 years, Mr. Walker," he said, his voice steady. "But now we've got you." John's heart beat faster. He could feel it thumping in his chest, each beat louder than the last. He had known this day would come. Somewhere deep down, he had always known. But he had never been ready for it. He stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The door was behind him, blocked by the detectives. He looked at the floor, then back at them. The weight of the truth was suffocating. He had thought he had outrun it, but now it was standing right in front of him. And there was no escape. The silence hung heavy in the air, like a curtain about to fall. John's hands shook as he looked up at them again, finally speaking, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The detectives didn't answer. They didn't need to. Their eyes said everything.
It was time for him to pay.
The seconds dragged on, thick with tension. John's heart thudded in his chest, each beat louder, faster. He could feel his pulse in his throat, his head swimming with panic. The detectives didn't move, didn't speak. They just stared at him, the silence pressing down like an invisible weight. He opened his mouth again, but his voice cracked. Nothing came out. His thoughts were a whirlwind, a blur of images from the past. The planning, the executions, the cleanup. The lies he had told himself. The people he had buried. His body trembled, and he couldn't control it. 30 years. 30 years of running, hiding, pretending. But now, in this moment, there was no escaping the truth. "Do you remember them?" Detective Ryan's voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. John's breath hitched. The question hung in the air, impossible to ignore.
He did.
He remembered them all. The young woman. The man with the crooked smile. The kid with the terrified eyes. He had forgotten their names, but their faces? They were burned into his memory. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the images, but they came flooding back, clearer than ever. "You thought you could walk away," Martin continued, his voice still steady, his words cutting deep. "You thought you could leave all of that behind." John felt his knees weaken. He couldn't stand. Not anymore. His legs gave out, and he dropped to the floor, his back against the cold, cracked wall. The detectives remained silent, but their presence was suffocating. John's breath came in sharp gasps. His mind raced. Why had he never expected this moment? The years of denial, of thinking he could outrun the consequences. It was all crashing down now. His life, his lies, everything he had built was unraveling before him. I didn't mean for it to." John tried to speak, but the words faltered, choked by the weight of everything he had done. Detective Ryan took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "You didn't mean for it to? You killed them. Every one of them. And for what?" He paused, his gaze turning cold. "To protect yourself? To save your skin? You've been running, Mr. Walker, but now you can't hide." John's body shook uncontrollably, the truth seeping into every pore, suffocating him. He had always thought he could escape, that he could bury the past deep enough to never see it again. But it had never really left. The truth always has a way of finding you. John's mind felt like it was unraveling, thread by thread. The words from the detective echoed in his head, spinning in a dizzying loop. "You've been running, Mr. Walker, but now you can't hide." He couldn't breathe. The cold air felt sharp against his skin, biting through the sweat that clung to him. The room had grown colder, or perhaps it was just him. He was trembling, his teeth chattering, his thoughts swirling in chaos. He had been so careful, so meticulous. But it had all been a lie he couldn't escape. Detective Martin took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. "We found the evidence. Your fingerprints, your DNA, your connection to every single crime scene. It's all there, Mr. Walker." John's chest tightened. How could he have been so foolish? 30 years had passed. 30 years of careful planning, of staying out of sight. He had thought he was smarter, faster than the law. He had convinced himself that time would erase everything. But it hadn't. It never does. "You thought you'd been forgotten," Ryan said, his tone cold, but there was a hint of satisfaction in his voice now. "But we never stopped looking for you. And now we've got you." The words hit John like a physical blow. He was trapped, cornered. There was nowhere left to run. His entire life had led him to this moment, and the weight of it was crushing him. The freedom he had fought so hard for, the life he had built on lies, was slipping away like sand through his fingers. He looked at the detectives, the two men who had finally found him after all these years. And then, for the first time in 30 years, John truly understood the cost of his actions. The silence in the room was deafening, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he could hear his own heartbeat. It wasn't just the detectives who were watching him. It was the ghosts of his past, the people he had taken from the world. They were there too, standing just behind the detectives, their accusing eyes boring into him. He had never faced them before, but now they were all around him. "You can't outrun the truth forever," Detective Martin said, his voice low but final. "It catches up to you whether you like it or not." John's breath caught in his throat. His whole body tensed. He couldn't look away from the detectives. He couldn't tear his eyes from the image of his past that loomed in the shadows. It was over.
He was done.
The door behind him felt miles away now. There was no escape. No more running. No more hiding. The truth had finally come for him. John could feel the floor beneath him shift, as if the very earth was pulling away from him. His thoughts were like broken glass, jagged and sharp, cutting through the fragile calm that had once held him together. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, his palms slick with sweat. His entire body felt like it was on fire, the heat of guilt and fear radiating from every pore. He couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. Every second that passed seemed to stretch into eternity. The silence between him and the detectives was unbearable. The weight of their gaze pressed down on him like an unrelenting force, leaving him unable to escape, unable to look away. His throat tightened, constricting with the weight of everything he had done, everything he had hidden for so long. "You are so careful," Detective Ryan said, his voice low, almost amused now. "So meticulous. But you were never truly safe. Were you? Not with the way you left traces behind." John's eyes darted to the window, the dim light from the street lamp casting long, twisting shadows against the walls. He wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't move. His body was frozen in place, held captive by the undeniable truth in front of him. The detectives didn't need to say another word. Their silence said it all. They had him. They had always had him. And now, the truth was flooding back, breaking the dam of denial that he had spent decades building. He had thought he could control everything. But in the end, the past had a way of catching up with you. It was like a storm waiting to unleash itself, and now it had finally arrived. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," John whispered, his voice barely audible. Ryan stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "It doesn't matter what you meant. What matters is what you did." John's heart was pounding in his chest, his vision blurring. The walls around him seemed to close in, the room shrinking with every breath he took. He wanted to explain, to plead for mercy, but the words wouldn't come. He was lost in the storm of his own guilt. Detective Martin crouched down in front of him, bringing his face close. "You thought you were above it all. But you never were, Mr. Walker. You were just hiding. And now, the world knows who you are." John's breath hitched, his entire body trembling. He had once believed he could outrun the law, that he could bury his past deep enough to never see it again. But the truth was like a shadow. It had always followed him, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And now that moment had come. It was over. The door was gone. The escape he had clung to for so long had disappeared into thin air. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, and there was no way out. John's chest heaved with each shallow breath, his hands still trembling, his fingers digging into the cold floor beneath him. The room felt like it was spinning, the walls closing in tighter with every passing second. He could hear his own heartbeat, deafening in the silence.
Thud, thud, thud.
The pressure in his head was unbearable. Every thought felt fragmented, like shards of glass lodged in his brain. He wanted to scream, to wake up from this nightmare, but he was awake. This was real, and there was no escape. He looked up at the detectives, their cold eyes piercing into him. He had lived in the shadows for so long, burying his past, ignoring the consequences of his actions. But now it was all crashing down. "You're not going anywhere." Detective Martin's voice cut through the silence, steady and certain. John felt a wave of nausea wash over him. His stomach churned as if something inside him was trying to claw its way out. 30 years, Mr. Walker," Ryan added, his voice almost mocking. 30 years you've had. And now we're here. The words echoed in John's mind, a relentless drumbeat. 30 years. It felt like a lifetime, and yet it was only a blink of an eye in the grand scheme of things. He had thought he was free. He had thought he was clever enough, smart enough, to slip through the cracks. But now, all of his lies, all of his carefully constructed walls, were crumbling around him. It was too late to deny it, too late to run. The past was here, standing in front of him, with the full force of the law behind it. John's eyes darted to the door, his final attempt at escape. But it was no use. The detectives were blocking it, their presence an unshakable barrier. He turned back to them, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. What do you want me to say?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "What can I say?" Martin didn't answer right away. He simply looked at him, his expression cold, unreadable. Ryan stepped forward, his boots making a soft thud against the floor. "You don't need to say anything. We already know what you've done." John's throat tightened, his hands balled into fists at his sides. The words felt like lead in his mouth. The truth was unbearable. 30 years, Detective Martin repeated, his voice thick with finality. "It ends now." John squeezed his eyes shut, but the memories wouldn't leave. The faces, the screams, the blood. He had thought it was all buried, hidden in the darkness, forgotten by time. But it was never forgotten. Not by them. And not by him. The weight of the words pressed down on him, each one sinking deeper into his chest, pushing the air out of his lungs. John's body felt hollow, as though every breath had been stolen from him. The detective stood before him, unmoving. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, too wide to bridge, too deep to fill. The memories, the flashes of his past, came rushing back now, unbidden, unforgiving. The people he had taken, their lives snatched away without mercy. The lies he had told himself to survive. The ones he had told the world. But the lies had shattered, and now there was nothing left. "What do you want me to do?" John whispered, his voice hoarse, barely a breath. "I can't change what's been done." Ryan's eyes darkened, but there was no pity in them. No sympathy. Only the cold certainty of justice. "You can't change the past, Mr. Walker. But you'll answer for it. Every last bit of it." John's throat felt raw, as if the very words were scraping against him, pulling everything he had buried to the surface. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The truth was suffocating him, and there was no escape. "You are so careful," Martin said, his voice calm but cutting. "So confident. But you weren't as clever as you thought. You never were. You thought you could bury it all, but it was always there, waiting for the right moment to come back and haunt you." John's head spun. He wanted to run. He wanted to make it stop. But his body betrayed him. He couldn't move. His mind was trapped, spiraling into a place he couldn't escape. The detectives weren't the only ones who had found him. His past was closing in, the ghosts of every life he had destroyed now standing before him. Their eyes burned into him. Their silence screamed at him. He had buried them all, but they were never really gone. They had always been there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the truth to finally catch up to him. You have nothing left to hide, Ryan continued. Nothing left to run from. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing against him as if the very air had turned to lead. John's body trembled violently now, the fear overwhelming him. His eyes darted to the door again, but the detectives were still there, their presence impenetrable. The truth had him cornered. There was no escape from it. No way to outrun it. It had finally caught up with him. I didn't think, John's words faltered, broken by the weight of what he could no longer deny. Martin leaned closer, his voice low but steady. You didn't think. That's the problem, isn't it, Mr. Walker? You never thought about anyone else. John wanted to say something, anything, to make it stop, to fight back, to plead for mercy. But his voice was gone. All that was left was the crushing weight of the truth. It had been 30 years. 30 years of hiding. 30 years of believing he was untouchable. But now, standing here, with everything unraveling before him, John understood. He had never been free. Not really. John's vision blurred, his chest tight with a suffocating pressure that had nothing to do with the air around him. He wanted to collapse, to escape the unbearable weight of it all, but his body remained frozen, paralyzed by the knowledge that it was finally over. The detectives stood over him like statues, unmovable, unyielding. Their eyes bored into him, unrelenting in their certainty. They knew the truth. They had always known. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, John managed to whisper again, his voice barely audible, trembling with fear. I didn't. But the words died on his lips, swallowed by the oppressive silence that hung in the room. Ryan crossed his arms, his face set in a hard, emotionless expression. You didn't mean for it to happen like this, he repeated, his voice laced with disdain. It doesn't matter what you meant, Mr. Walker. The people you took, they didn't get a choice. And now, you don't get to choose either. John's throat burned with the effort of holding back the tears that threatened to spill. He couldn't let himself break down. Not here, not now. But it felt like the dam inside him was ready to burst, and the flood of emotions, guilt, shame, regret, was far too overwhelming to control. 30 years. He had spent all this time thinking he was free, thinking the past had been left behind, buried in the dust of time. But it wasn't gone. It never was. And now, the truth had found its way back to him, bringing with it the weight of every life he had destroyed. Please, John whispered, his voice raw. I didn't know what else to do. Detective Martin crouched down, meeting John's eyes with a cold, unforgiving stare. You had a choice, Mr. Walker, he said quietly, his voice carrying a quiet but undeniable authority. You always had a choice. But you chose to take those lives. And now, you will answer for it. John's breath caught in his chest. There was no escaping it. The consequences of his actions were inevitable. He could not run them anymore. The door, the escape he had once believed was possible, was closed now. The detectives were the final barrier, and behind them was the truth he had spent years running from. He had tried to be someone else. He had tried to outrun the person he had become, but it was futile. The truth had caught up with him, and there was no pretending anymore. John sank back against the wall, his head hanging low. He didn't know what else to say. There was no excuse. There was no defense. He had made his choices, and now he had to face the consequences. The silence in the room was suffocating, but it was also final. It was the moment when the past collided with the present, when the man he had been met the man he was now. There would be no more running, no more hiding. The truth had won, and John Walker was out of time. John sat there, his mind a whirlwind of broken thoughts, but everything seemed to slow down. The coldness of the room seeped into his bones, his body trembling with the weight of the moment. He looked at the detectives, their faces steady, unflinching. It was like they were standing at the edge of a precipice, waiting for him to make the final fall. For so long, John had lived in the shadows, hiding behind lies, and a mask of indifference. He had convinced himself that he was untouchable, that the past was something that could be erased with enough time. But time was a lie. The past had a way of clawing its way back, no matter how far you ran, no matter how many doors you closed behind you. It had waited, silently, patiently, and now it had him. Ryan's voice cut through the thick air again, his words like a blade. "It ends here, Mr. Walker. 30 years of running, 30 years of thinking you were clever enough to get away with it. It ends now." The words echoed in John's head, the finality of them sinking in. This was it. He wasn't going to walk out of this room. The life he had carefully constructed was crumbling around him, and all he had left were the consequences. The faces of those he had wronged flashed before his eyes, those whose lives he had taken so thoughtlessly, their cries still lingering in the dark corners of his mind. John's breath was shallow, his chest tight with regret, but it was too late for apologies. He had been given 30 years to make things right, and he had squandered them. Now there was nothing left but the inevitable reckoning. He finally looked up at the detectives, his eyes filled with the weight of what he knew he could never undo. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Martin's gaze was unwavering. "Now, we take you in?" John nodded, his face drained of color. There was no fight left in him, no will to resist. The door was no longer an option. He stood up slowly, his knees weak, but there was a strange sense of peace settling over him. The truth had caught up with him, and there was no running anymore. As the detectives led him toward the door, John realized, for the first time in years, that he was finally facing the consequences of his actions. He had nowhere else to go. And for the first time in 30 years, he felt the weight of it, completely, overwhelmingly. The door closed behind him, and it was over. John felt the cold metal of the handcuffs click shut around his wrists, the sound almost too loud in the stillness of the room. He could barely comprehend what was happening, his thoughts tangled in a haze of disbelief. The detectives moved efficiently, guiding him toward the door. Each step he took felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of 30 years of guilt was settling on his shoulders all at once. As they passed through the hallway, the echoes of his footsteps seemed to reverberate off the walls, a constant reminder of the life he had led. The sharp clink of the handcuffs was like a cruel metronome, marking the final moments of his freedom. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the panic and regret, a part of him knew this was what he deserved. The truth had finally come for him, and there was no escaping it now. They reached the door, and as it swung open, the outside world greeted him with an unyielding coldness, a stark contrast to the warmth of the room he had just left. The night air hit his face, sharp and biting. The world outside hadn't changed. It was the same world he had left behind, the one he had tried to outrun for so long. But now, it felt distant, foreign, as though he no longer belonged to it. The detectives led him to the car, the familiar smell of leather and metal filling his senses as they shoved him into the back seat. His reflection in the rearview mirror caught his eye, and for the first time in years, he saw himself clearly. There was no mask anymore. No lies. Just the man he had become, broken and stripped of the illusions he had once held onto. The car started, and they drove in silence. The city passed by, a blur of lights and shadows, indifferent to the man sitting in the back seat. As the distance between him and the life he had once known grew, a strange sense of finality washed over him. He had spent so long trying to outrun the truth, and now, for the first time, he understood that it wasn't the truth that had chased him. It was his own conscience. It had always been there, waiting for the right moment to break through. And now that moment had come. The car slowed, pulling up to the station. The door opened, and as he was escorted out, John's eyes found the ground. He wasn't looking for an answer anymore. There was no more fighting, no more excuses. It was time to face what he had done. The door slammed shut behind him, and with it, the final chapter of his story. And just like that, John Walker was no longer a man running from the past. He was a man finally ready to face it,